Welcome to our weekly Ethnic Media Zoom conference, tracking the key issues and trends impacting ethnic communities. I'm Sandy Close, Director of EMS. Today, we're excited to have a terrific panel of analysts share their perspectives on the historic turnout of ethnic voters in the November 3rd election and what the election portends for immigration reform. Our speakers include Theodore R. Johnson, Senior Fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, and now a veteran reporter. Frank Sherry, Executive Director of America's Voice and longtime expert and strategist on immigration reform. Dr. Stephen Nuno Perez, Senior Analyst for Latino Decisions, a national Latinx polling firm, and Associate Professor with Northern Arizona University. John C. Yang, President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and Mark Trahant, editor of Indian Country Today. Mr. Trahant has prepared a video presentation since at the last minute he was unable to join the panel in person. Please enter your questions for speakers in the chat box. We will open the conference for questions at the conclusion of the last speaker. We started these Friday Zoom briefings on March 27th to track the impact of COVID-19. This is our 31st weekly conference, and our agenda has greatly expanded. Next week, we'll return to the pandemic with Doctors Ashish Jha and Tung Nguyen, among other experts. On behalf of EMS, thanks to Blue Shield of California Foundation, and for today's briefing, the State Infrastructure Fund for their support. To our veteran reporters, Pilar Marrero and Sunita Sarabji, who coordinate these weekly Zoom briefings. To our interpreters, Oscar Arteta and Jackie No, who provide simultaneous interpreting in Spanish and Korean. And of course, our deep thanks to today's speakers and reporters for joining the conference. We will send a video of today's call along with collateral material, including Mr. Johnson's Washington Post story from today and extended bios. Now I'm turning the conference over to our moderator, Pilar Marrero.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you everyone for joining. Good morning. I speak for all the reporters on the line. I know everyone's exhausted. I don't know if you are, but I am. Raise your hand. But we have had, I think journalism has, and most journalism has actually done its job this week in this historic moment of our country. So thank you all for being here. I'm gonna just open the floor and invite Mr. Theodore Johnson to just do his remarks. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining. Okay, so I'll try to do this comprehensively and quickly, and I think I've got 8 or 9 minutes or so. So one of the first things about the Black vote in the United States, it is that it is one of the most, American politics is defined, one of the most defining features of American politics is the Black American vote. Let me say it that way. And by this, I mean that there is no other block of voters in the country of this size and of this, with this amount of electoral power that behaves in the way that the Black American electorate does for this long. For nearly 6 decades, about 90% of Black Americans have voted for the Democratic candidate for president and for congressional elections. And this follows a long history ever since the end of the Civil War, where Black voters, to the extent that they were enfranchised, more times than not, lumped themselves on one side of our two-party system as a way of exercising their electoral power through racial solidarity and also combating racism that often clustered itself in the other party. And so the participation of Black Americans in American politics has often been a way of furthering civil rights and of protecting against either overt racism or racial conservatism put in other ways. And so what we saw this year is what we expected to see. From 1964 to 2004, the Black Americans have voted, look, frankly, from 1964 to this year, about 90% of Black Americans have supported Democratic candidates. Now, there was an uptick in that the years that Barack Obama ran for the presidency in 2008 and 2012. This year, what we saw from exit polls, and the exit polls that I use are from the AP Votecast, which showed that 90% of Black Americans supported Joe Biden and 8% of Black Americans supported Donald Trump. This looks exactly like 2016, when about 89% of Black Americans voted for Hillary Clinton and about 8% of Black Americans supported Donald Trump. There is a gender gap among Black Americans, as there are with every other race and ethnicity. The first one is the one that's most common, and it's between men and women. In Black America in 2016, the turnout rate for Black women was 10% higher than it was for Black men. And I expect once the numbers are crunched for this election, we'll see the same thing. Additionally, Black men are more likely to support Republican candidates, and that includes Donald Trump, than Black women are. In 2016, 4% of Black women supported Donald Trump compared to 13% of Black men. This year, 6% of Black women supported Donald Trump compared to 12% of Black men. And so the gap actually shrunk this year from where it was in 2016. Here's the other thing about Black voting behavior. From 1964 to 2004, about 11-ish% of Black Americans supported Republican Party candidates. And then, of course, that dipped in 2008 and 2012 when Barack Obama was on the ticket. It dipped down to 4% and then to 6%. And then it rebounded a little bit in 2016, where Donald Trump got 8%, as I mentioned. But what this tells us is that Donald Trump actually performed every other Republican presidential candidate going back to 1964 with Black voters. And even as he talked about the gains he made in the Platinum Plan and HBCU funding and low unemployment rates and criminal justice reform, none of those policy appeals moved Black voters. The increase that we saw in Donald Trump's 2016 victory and his output this year is mostly attributed to Black Republicans who decided they wanted to support the first Black president, who happened to be a Democrat in 2008 and 2012, coming back home to the Republican Party in 2016 and 2020. And to some extent, those who sat out elections previously got re-engaged. So that sort of explains a little bit of the partisan breakdown. But we know that the presidential election, no matter really writ large, no matter race, group, et cetera, the winner of the election is the side that does a better job of getting their voters to the polls. The Knight Foundation study from a few years ago suggested that of the 100 million Americans that sit out elections, they are basically evenly divided between those who lean Democrat and those who lean Republican, which is to say non-voters in the United States look just like voters in the United States in terms of their political ideology. So expanding the access to the ballot does not advantage any one party over another. And the only way a party can get an advantage from a high or low turnout is who decides to stay home and not participate. And the side, again, that does a better job of getting their people to the poll win. We are seeing it this year. Record turnout, the highest turnout in 120 years, and this thing is razor thin close. If you take California, the popular vote disparity in California, this year it's over 4 million votes, 2016 it's over 4 million votes. You basically get a popular vote that is really, really close in the other 49 states, which is to say we are a nation that is about evenly divided between the parties. Normally that's not a problem, but in a hyper-partisan environment, it is a problem. And where the anomalies are is really with African Americans who again cluster themselves in the one party. The reason for the Joe Biden support from African American voters this year is more about investing their electoral power in the Democratic candidate they believed had the best shot at beating Donald Trump. And while a lot of the analysis during the primary system suggested that Kamala Harris or Cory Booker would have the inside track with Black voters because of that descriptive representation, we quickly learned as soon as Black voters got a chance to weigh in the primary in South Carolina and Super Tuesday that that wasn't the fact. that wasn't true. In fact, Black voters were more pragmatic, looking to the candidate they were familiar with, who had sort of shown his mettle by sticking beside Barack Obama for nearly a decade as his running mate and his vice president, and who they thought had the best chance of winning over certain segments of the white electorate that would be necessary to carry battleground states and win the presidency. And the selection of Kamala Harris as the vice president also, I think, contributed to the increase in Black turnout that we saw and the increase in enthusiasm for this election. All of those things, and I'll sort of conclude on this point, all of those things benefited from the high African-American turnout, lopsided support for this Democratic ticket. Those things were put on steroids in this election because of the challenges that 2020 has brought. Coronavirus has hurt Black and brown communities more than it has others. It's killed Black folks disproportionately. When the economy started to fail, Black folks were laid off at disproportionate rates and are on unemployment at disproportionate rates, and their unemployment rate is disproportionately high. And on Memorial Day, when George Floyd was killed, within about a 3-week span, the Black Americans learned about Breonna Taylor being killed in Louisville. They learned about, they saw the tape of Ahmaud Arbery being killed by vigilantes in Georgia. And then they watched for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, George Floyd being killed in Minnesota. The summer of racial justice protests, plus high unemployment, plus low economic security, alongside a coronavirus pandemic, contributed to a lot of voter enthusiasm to remove Donald Trump from office. And that explains why we're seeing Atlanta change Georgia, Philadelphia change Pennsylvania, Milwaukee change Wisconsin, and Detroit change Michigan from 2016. And that's the power and the enthusiasm of the Black voter.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. And to my colleagues today, we're taking note of your questions. Today, we're going to leave the questions until the end because we have 5 speakers and we want to make sure we give all of them equal time. So we're going to go to our second speaker, Frank Sherry, who is Executive Director of America's Voice. And he's going to talk to us about how immigration played out in this election. And you are welcome, Frank.
Hello, Pilar, and hello,
Hi.
Sandy. Thank you so much for including me in this. I am going to take a different approach from the other speakers. Ted spoke about African-American voters. John will speak about the AAPI electorate, and Stephen will talk about the Latino electorate. I do want to, many of us were involved in a big effort called the American Election Eve poll, which did a deep dive on African-American, Latino, AAPI, Native American voting attitudes, as well as white Americans, and a very cool interactive website. So I just wanted to do that public service announcement. I also wanted to take a moment and just as a white American, I hope I can get through this. I wanted to thank people of color and communities of color for saving our democracy. You know, I come from a community that voted in the majority for Donald Trump. And if not for the African-American, Latinx, and Asian American and Pacific Islander community, we would not be celebrating the victory that we're celebrating today. So I just wanted to express my gratitude. Let me talk about how immigration showed up. We all know that when Donald Trump came down that escalator in 2015, the original sin of Trumpism was xenophobia. He demonized immigrants from the first time he spoke, and it became the signature issue for this administration. And he and his White House aide, Stephen Miller, have taken a wrecking ball to our immigration and refugee system. And it's been the defining issue of this administration. They thought, because in 2016, they thought it helped them win, that by emphasizing it as much as they did, it would create a political majority on the back of racism and xenophobia. Today, we can say that their reliance on racism and xenophobia has failed. Indeed, I would argue that it's backfired. That what happened, you saw it in 2018. Remember, Trump nationalized the midterm race, talking about caravans and criminals, and with using language that incited racism, unlike we've seen in American politics recently. and it failed. Massive turnout, massive rejection of Republicans, and the Democrats took the House. In 2020, Trump was at it again. It was more the anti-Black racism than the anti-immigrant xenophobia, but he did both. If you listen to his speeches, he was accusing Somalis of being terrorists and Mexicans of being bad hombres and the rest of it. But the fact is that Americans rejected this. This is an old politics. It didn't start with Donald Trump. In the politics business, it's a wedge issue. It's an issue that divides and demoralizes your opponents, and it scrapes off centrist voters who are uncomfortable by the fear that's generated by the attacks. Immigration has been a wedge issue that Republicans have wielded for 30 years. And in this election, it failed. In this election, it failed. The wedge of immigration is losing its edge. Why is it losing its edge? Because of public opinion, because of voter support, because of organizing in immigrant communities, because of progressives making immigration a top priority. So what you have now is an American public that was forced by Donald Trump and his extremism to choose. And they chose to come down on the side of refugees and immigrants. That is a very powerful statement. That is not a statement just of what candidates and politicians do. It's a statement of what a multiracial majority in America said through this election. They said, we want to be a welcoming country. We don't like Trump's separation of families. We don't like the idea that he could just close down immigration using the pandemic as cover. We don't like the idea of gutting asylum and turning people back who come to our shores seeking freedom. They don't like the policy of putting dreamers and TPSers on a pathway to citizenship. The fact is that this was in part a referendum on immigration. I see somebody saying, yeah, but a lot of people voted for Trump. Indeed, they did. Indeed, they did. And a bigger majority, a historic majority, voted against him. So when the defining issue of the man on the ballot, and when he goes down to defeat because a record number of Americans said no, that is the day that I'm going to celebrate. I have experienced immigration as a wedge issue for 30 years. On this side of this election, we can say that Americans were tested, they were forced to decide, and they chose. They chose on the side of America being a welcoming country. So I'm optimistic. I think we're going to be able to undo most of what Trump has done, move forward to build a new system. And it's not going to be easy because the Republicans are going to continue to try to divide and conquer through racism and xenophobia. But I think the American people are congealing in a majority and ready to move forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for your passion and your work. We certainly experienced this in California 25 years ago. We had elections led by racism and xenophobia, and the voters changed that. So California is now a very progressive state. We're going to move on to our third speaker, Dr. Stephen Nuño Perez, Senior Analyst of Latino Decisions. Hi, Stephen. How are you?
Hi, Pilar. How's it going?
Good. And can you allow him to share his screen? You're going to share your screen with the
Yes, please.
slides? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Control room.
This should work. Let's see.
Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. First, thanks for inviting me here. This is an amazing time. Thanks to Frank and Ted. Especially when we're talking about what this means for our country. And one of the saddest things I think about Donald Trump is coming to some recognition or to some realization about who we are as a country. And perhaps, and what I tell my students is, now that we know, the test of our character is what we do now. And I think as we move forward, I think that's probably the most important thing in what's going to define who we are as a country and who we are as our neighbors. Because it hurts a little bit as a minority to know that your neighbors don't exactly see you as a human being. That said, this is a positive time. I think this is a time to celebrate, I think. And one of those things, as Ted was saying, is when we see how the Black vote impacted Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and when we look at Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, Atlanta, when you concentrate and when we look at motivated voters in these areas, it's very difficult to win an election in Georgia and Michigan when you mobilize Black voters in Detroit. And moving out west, when we talk about Latinos, extremely difficult to win an election when you have mobilized minorities, Hispanics, Latinos in Phoenix, in Las Vegas, in Albuquerque, in Los Angeles. If you have these mobilized voters on election day, it's very difficult to win an election. I hope the lesson here over the next 2 years is that if you are a state legislator, or if you are a US senator, or if you are a congressperson who was expecting to not do the work and was expecting to ride coattails in this election, and you lost, or you came in a thinner margin than you were expecting, the lesson here is that minorities, especially Latinos, cannot be ignored on election day. Now, we are very happy about the results, but there is a lot of down ballot races in which people who were expecting to win didn't really put in the work over the last 2 years, and are now seeing some lessons here on what it takes to win. Fortunately, we had at the national level high engagement with Latinos, but as Ted said, a lot of this had to do with Latinos responding to an extremely hostile administration. The organizing on the ground in places like Phoenix and in Las Vegas are paying off, and this began decades ago. This didn't just happen last year. So engaging Latinos on the ground is going to reap benefits for you in the future. And we can see what happens when you to try to depend on coattails and not engage Latinos on the ground. One of the other sorts of stories that I like to tell when I speak to the media is, yes, Latinos are not a monolith, and yes, Latinos are a monolith. It's a very complicated discussion to have because Latinos are very complicated. They come from different origins. They have different immigration stories. They're amongst the oldest and youngest members of our nation. We do have issues with our former past, right? With our colonial history, whether it's racism, whether it's indigeneity, whether it's misogyny. We have these issues in our own communities as well that need to be dealt with on the ground when politicians are talking to and engaging with Latino voters. So it's complicated, but in some ways it's also not that complicated, right? There is a Latino vote. And oftentimes we get media folks that say, yeah, I understand that Latinos are not a monolith. And that's great because we've been pushing that message out for decades, that you have to treat Latinos as if this, the old days that, all politics is local. But when we look at the numbers like this, there is a Latino politics. They do respond to certain stimuli. They do respond to certain types of messaging at the national level. And 70% of Latinos nationally voted for Biden. And we can see a pattern here when you start to look at this. Now, some places stick out. Obviously, Florida has been the obvious one that the media has been focused on. But keep in mind, Miami-Dade did go to Biden. Tampa Bay did go to Biden. Orlando did go to Biden. Broward County did go to Biden. And Latinos are overwhelmingly in these places in Florida. So when we're trying to kind of diagnose what happened, or the quote unquote what happened, largely what happened was, white voters, and they turned out in numbers. Latinos turned out in numbers. Blacks turned out in numbers. The Asian American community turned out in numbers. And we can see that we had a very motivated base on both sides as a referendum on Donald Trump and what was going on with COVID-19. These communities, especially the Black community and the Latino community, the American Indian community, were just being ravaged by COVID-19 and responding to that on election day. Here's some random numbers, or some numbers on how this vote breakdown and between Biden and Trump. And we can see that there are differences within this community, whether it's men and women. There was a 14-point gap in vote choice this is favorability between Biden and Trump. We see some variation with age, and we're all very familiar with the age gap in Latinos. Latinos are a very young group, median age 28 years old. White median age is 48 years old, right? These have consequences on the ground, and if you don't engage on that level, you're not going to reap the benefits of this community on election day. Here's country of origin. We know this very well. We're very familiar with this. Cuban Americans were the only group, 52 to 45, for Trump, and this is going to be a media line for years to come, right? So we're going to be seeing a lot of this. There was a lot of discussion about certain places, whether it's in Arizona, and I think I have some numbers here on Texas. We see a pattern here, right? And you can see when we're looking at these patterns, yeah, there outliers. Yes. Are we going to cherry pick a county in Southern Texas to try to define Latinos by that county? I urge you not to do that, because when we look at the patterns here, we see patterns. And I think truth and honesty is about, when we pick a county to define Latinos, the questions that we should ask is this county an outlier, and should we discuss it as an outlier, or is this county an outlier, and are we trying to define the general patterns by this outlier? And so, yeah, patterns matter, outliers matter. Those are interesting, but also these patterns are very important to keep in mind when we're discussing the diversity of the Latino vote. Here's Philadelphia and Dallas. Again, similar patterns emerge. The more Latinos you have in your county, the more, or in your precinct, the more likely you're going to get Latino voters. So we continue to see this, and this is whether it's in Texas, whether it's in even in places like Florida, obviously Arizona, Nevada. We see this pattern around the country. So these patterns matter, and the outliers are particular to certain stories that I think are very important. Representative votes, we can see here that we see some variation, more variation, and this is kind of underlines the argument that all politics is local. So if you were a House of Representative member and you lost your election and you thought you were going to win a close race, the first question you should ask yourself is, tell me the staffer on your campaign that was responsible for Latino turnout. If you can't answer that question without giving me without two words, first name and last name, that's probably why you lost your election if you're in one of these states. So that's probably, if you're in the media, probably the first question you should ask someone who is losing a tight race, or maybe even winning a tight race, is asking for the first and last name of the person on the campaign responsible for Latino turnout. And of course, this goes for Black turnout and Asian American turnout, depending on where you're at. And so when we're looking at an extremely important runoff election in Georgia, keep in mind that Georgia was won because of a mobilized base in Atlanta, but Georgia only won by about 4,000 votes. 8% of the Georgia population is Latino. So even if you had a similarly motivated base in Georgia between whites, progressive whites, and African Americans, Latinos can be the tipping point for you if you engage that community. And hopefully that lesson is learned in this election, that the margins, when Arizona is being won by 40, 50,000 votes, Michigan, in Wisconsin by tens of thousands of votes. When you think about Milwaukee, also forming coalitions, Latinos between African Americans and Latinos in Milwaukee, in Atlanta, in Philadelphia, these coalitions are really important to nurture for politicians. And so I think I'll stop there. I think that's my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that very informative talk. And we're going to move on to Mr. John C. Yang, President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Welcome. You're unmuted.
Thank you very much. My name is John Yang. I'm the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. First, let me thank Frank and all of our other speakers on this call. I especially want to thank Frank in terms of providing some framing. And let me tell you one quick personal story of mine. Because when he referred to the elevator coming down and Trump announcing for president, that was a defining moment for me as well. That is when I decided I want to take a different path in my career and decided to become the Executive Director of Advancing Justice, AAJC. Because when he talked about illegal aliens being rapists and gangsters and criminals, he was talking about me, because I was at one point an undocumented immigrant. And to suggest that somehow that I am a drain on society and not contributing to this United States that I belong to was deeply offensive and personal. And so to see this election come out the way that it did is personally meaningful to me, as well as with respect to the mission of our organization. So let me tell you a little bit about the Asian American perspective. And there's so much to unpack here. And I really appreciate the previous speakers for laying out the African American, Latino American perspectives. Let me break it down into two pieces, one on voter participation and identification, and the second about a little bit about the story of Asian Americans in voting in 2020. So first, with respect to participation and identification. Now, it's important to know that we're still voting, and we need to respect the fact that all votes are still being counted right now. These are votes that were submitted by Election Day or in the mail by Election Day, still being counted. So the picture is still evolving, and we need to recognize that. But there are certain things that we can know now. One is that over 300,000 Asian Americans participated in the election for the first time, even before Election Day, based on numbers provided by an organization called Catalyst. So Asian American participation was clearly up in significant ways. Second is based on survey data that we produced along with AAPI data and APIA vote, we know that Asian Americans were more enthusiastic about this election than in previous elections by a rate of 54%. So the majority of Asian Americans were much more enthusiastic about voting in this election than in previous presidential elections. The other data point is that about a third of Asian Americans live in the 10 battleground states. And that accounts for about 2 million, a significant amount of Asian American participation in the rolls. It's interesting because I on one hand, I would want to say that Asian Americans provided the difference, because Asian Americans are 11% of Nevada, 4% of Arizona, almost 5% of Georgia, 4% of Pennsylvania. And so if you look at the margins in all of those states, clearly you can say that Asian Americans provided that margin of victory. But I think the broader perspective is that all of our communities together provided that margin of victory. It was the African American leaders and the community, with the Latino American communities and leaders, the LGBTQ, the Native American, along with the Asian Americans, everyone recognizing our common values, and that caused this election to turn out the way that it did. So on one level, Asian Americans certainly did their fair share. All of the exit polls that we have, as well as the pre-election polls that have been done by organizations, including ours, show that Asian Americans voted against Trump. Trump only got about 30% of the Asian American vote. Asian Americans typically voted somewhere between 65 to 70% for Biden, depending on the survey that you're looking at. And that is actually consistent with prior years, whether it's the Clinton-Trump election of 2016 or Biden-Romney in 2012. So in that sense, there's not a significant delta in terms of shifts in political allegiance, but it does show that Asian Americans did turn out in significant numbers for this particular election. Second is with respect to political participation. And what I mean here is Asian Americans in Congress. Again, the story is still being told. We may be adding a couple of members of Congress. There are some that are still in undecided races. There is 2 Republicans that are Asian American that are running that are currently leading in California, Young Kim and Michelle Park Steele. Those are too close to call right now. On the flip side, there's one Asian American, TJ Cox, Filipino American, that is down in the rolls, in the vote, but actually he was the last election to be called in the 2018 cycle. He was losing in the vote count, and as the ballots were being counted, he made up the margins similar to what we've been seeing at the presidential levels for that election, so that he was elected. So we'll see where that ends up. Obviously, we've lost 1 member in the Senate, but obviously that is a good story, because for the first time ever, there is an Asian American, a South Asian American, that is the vice president of the United States, a woman of color being the vice president of the United States. And I can't tell you how significant that is for the Asian American community writ large. At the state and local level, we shouldn't forget that there's a number of things happening. There are first Asian American members of state houses, state assemblies in a number of places. We don't have all of the statistics yet, but I know at least in Wisconsin, in Missouri, in Pennsylvania, we've seen first. Pennsylvania, it's the state Senate for the first time in the upper house, so to speak. You've seen an Asian American be elected. And we've seen Asian Americans increase in numbers. In Georgia, they've added at least 2. In Illinois, they've added at least 2. So that participation at the elected officials level is certainly going up as well. And the last thing I would say, because I want to be respectful of time, is just how much work went into protecting Asian American, with respect to protecting Asian Americans and the vote. And so a number of organizations worked on all sorts of different efforts. There was a hotline that our organization, as well as API A Vote, has operated for many election cycles. We saw almost 1,000 calls on election day itself. We operate in multiple languages. About 250 of those calls were in Asian languages. Leading up to the election, there were about 3,500 calls that we've received. We also provided, a number of organizations provided fact sheets in at least 11 different Asian languages, talking about COVID-19 safety, how to protect your ballot, how to vote, security for your own physical self, recognizing that there were voter intimidation tactics that were in play, as well as providing messaging guidance with respect to this post-election, that, as all of you know as journalists, was very, very important. And I appreciate the work that all of you did as well in making sure that we provided the right framing. The fact that there were counts still happening wasn't anything suspect, that this was democracy in action. And it was critical for our communities that are limited English proficient, that do not understand our election process in the same way, to understand that this is not a reason for concern, that the elections have not been called, that a president has not been, quote unquote, selected yet, but rather is part of the process. So just as I said that the presidential election itself was an all of community effort, certainly with respect to this voter piece, it was all of community effort as well. Very proud of the Asian American community in the way in which they turned up and the way in which they supported each other in a very unique and very difficult time with respect to voting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. And we're going to watch the video where the editor of Indian Country Today, Mark Trahant, speaks about the native vote. What's happening with the video, guys? Are we having technical issues? Okay, we're going to take a question because obviously we're having technical issues right now. So, and that was, the video was the last panelist to speak. So let's see. Sunita, you had a question for Ted.
I would like to ask a couple of questions to all the speakers. One, there are a number of surveys released recently that show the large number of voters who now identify as independents, especially among younger voters. Do you see this playing out longer term, or was this exclusive to this election? And my second question is, given that Democrats did not flip the Senate and that we've lost a number of seats in the House, do we still face the gridlock that we've been seeing over the past 2 years?
This is for anyone who wants to answer that question.
Yeah, okay, here we go. Yeah.
Or Ted.
Yeah, so very quickly on those two questions. The first is among African Americans, independent, the number of registered independent voters has slightly gone up over the years. And that's mostly because the voters don't feel like the parties are being responsive to them. And so it's sort of it doesn't change their voting behavior. You see 90% that will vote for Democrats, but their decision to step outside of the party and not become, a registered partisan is sort of an expression of dissatisfaction with the party itself. I don't think that trend is going to change much. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised to see more registered independents in the next presidential election among Black voters than now. On the second question about the Senate, one of the most shocking things I saw this morning was Mitch McConnell say that he's looking forward, if Biden wins fairly and squarely, he looks forward to helping him confirm his cabinet as long as they don't include any radicals. And I read that as the guy that it literally said after Barack Obama was elected that our goal is to make sure he is not reelected, and not can he govern well, not what's good for the country, but to make sure he gets defeated on day one. And before Biden even has this election, saying, I'm willing to work with him, his confirmations through, suggests to me that the problem that McConnell had with the Democratic Party a decade ago wasn't about policy, it was about the person. And the last thing I'll say is when it is said that I'll work with you and confirm your folks as long as they're not too radical, I take that immediately as thinking of, he's talking about people like the Squad, who just so happen to all be women of color. And so I do think race plays a significant part in how these two branches are going to get along with this leadership. And this is not for better or for worse. This is actually not a good thing. Even if it does mean Biden can work better with the Senate, it's for the wrong reasons, even if ultimately some good policy may come out of it.
Thank you.
Nope. Frank, do you want to say anything?
Well, just on governing, first of all, the Senate is not yet decided. I know it's being reported that we lost a couple of seats in North Carolina and Maine, and therefore it's difficult. It is difficult, but a couple of things. So there's a net 2 seats have flipped, right? 2 seats have flipped in Colorado and Arizona, and there are 2 Senate races in Georgia that are going to a special election on January 5th. And then just to mention, it's not getting a lot of attention, in Alaska, only about half the vote is in, and there's an outside chance that Senate race might be in play. So I just think we need to take a deep breath and say, wow, if there are 2 Senate seats up for grabs January 5th in Georgia, a state that remarkably went from red to blue, and that those 2 seats would mean that the Democrats would be in control of the Senate, then we are far from making that final determination. And so I want to mention that. And then the other thing, at least on immigration, the area I'm most familiar with, as we saw with the previous administration, or this current administration, there is a lot that can be done with executive authority and administrative action. And so the idea that immigration is going to be an area where it's all legislation or nothing, that's not the case. Obviously, if a Senate is Democratic, there's a better chance to pass a broad path to citizenship bill. On the other hand, they're going to have to pass a relief package. What about dreamers and TPSers and farm workers and essential workers? Aren't they part of what's critical to a national recovery? So I do think there's going to be opportunities both through the broad power available to the executive branch in itself, and then even in the few legislative opportunities that will require bipartisan support, that there may be a chance to make some advances. So let's see what happens in January. Let's see what happens in Alaska. And then let's take advantage of every ounce of power we have to make change.
Thank you, Frank. We do have a lot of questions, but we're going to watch that video. Hopefully. I cannot hear it. Can you hear it? Cannot hear it.
Here, and before I talk about thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm coming to you from the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center, where we built a studio.
Can you hear it?
Yes, please. Yes, we can hear it. Let's keep it going.
It's been a remarkable year. And before I talk about the election results in Indian country, let me say something about my colleagues at Indian country.
Okay, now we can.
And our broadcast continues to grow as it gets picked up by more and more public television stations. We hope to be able to reach 100 million households by next year, and all that through public television. So what does this mean? It means the story of Indian country is getting told in a new framework. When the PBS NewsHour, for example, has a question about what's going on in a tribal community, they ask us what we think, who we should talk with, what's the story. When we write about a problem at the Phoenix Indian Medical Center, as we did last month, that story goes out worldwide on the wires of the Associated Press. This changes for better the story about tribal nations, and it makes us much more part of the mainstream conversation. Election night was particularly important for us. This was our second election night special. We broadcast for 2 hours, interviewing Native vote candidates. We heard from watch parties. We reported who won and lost through a Native perspective. Our lead story was that 6 Native American candidates were elected to the House of Representatives. And that would not have been a mainstream story a few years ago. And that's now changed forever. We have a lot of work remaining to do. We built a studio just for one night, and the technical challenges were, let's just say, daunting. Nonetheless, we defied gravity again and pulled it off. In addition to the public television audience, we reached more than 30,000 people directly on our live stream. In the 19th century, Cherokee editor Elias Boudinot called this a spacious channel. And our spacious channel is getting stronger every day. And if you think about what that means, anytime you have an opinion you want in the world, send it to our op-ed editor. We try to keep our pages completely open. The fact is, you don't have to tell us when something is newsworthy. We already get it, and that's something you won't get with mainstream media. Let's turn to the election. Many years ago, when I was a professor, I started tracking the Native American candidates running for public office. This is now a team project that we take seriously. This project was led by Aaliyah Chavez. We found more than 110 candidates running for offices across the country, from Congress to county commissions. How successful were those efforts? Well, let's start with Congress. The next Congress will have a true Native American caucus, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. This will give a bipartisan spin on Native issues, a channel for Democrats to operate in and the majority, and a second channel for Republicans. In state 8 races, there were some real success stories. Native candidates swept across Kansas, 3 going to the next legislature. Christina Haswood will become Kansas's youngest sitting legislator ever, and no one filed a runner against her in the general election. Representative Punkaway Vickers won a 6th term. She was the first Native American woman elected to the Kansas legislature when she ran a decade ago. And soon to be serving as Representative-elect Stephanie Byers, who will be the first transgender woman in that legislature. And of course, Kansas also reelected Representative Sharice Davids for her 2nd term. I should add that those of us who follow politics see second terms as the most important. because once you do that, the power of incumbency is particularly significant. Another state I should mention is Arizona. This was important because of the ground game operation. I know there was a lot of attention paid to Zoom campaigns and videos, but in this case, there was also an old-fashioned ground game working to increase the native vote. It was particularly done by Democrats, but they had some 30 paid organizers out and about in Navajo, Hopi, and Apache communities. It's really hard to understate the significance of that kind of operation. Despite what you might have heard on CNN or other networks, there was a significant increase in the native vote as a result, especially in Coconino and Apache counties, but also in Navajo County. 4 years ago, for example, only 25,000 people voted for Hillary Clinton in Coconino County, which is the western part of the Navajo Nation. This time around, that number was 38,000 for Joe Biden, huge increase. Not everything election night went perfect for Native candidates, of course. Not a single Native American won a statewide race, something that did happen 2 years ago. And in the days ahead, we have a lot of sorting to figure out, looking under the hood at the numbers. A lot of the legislative races still have not been called. They just don't get the same attention as national races. But we'll update them in real time at Indian Country Today. And if you haven't seen it, we have a really cool interactive map that tracks each of the candidates. So what do I want to know now? I really want more information about the youth vote. In past elections, there's a correlation between first-time voters and long-time voting trends. We need to find out a lot more about what motivated people and will they stay at it? Will they vote every election? And what will that mean going forward for shaping elections, especially if the results were not exactly what they expected this first time? In the year ahead, the real next important battle is redistricting. This will really define how successful Native candidates will be for really the next decade. And it's a basic, simple math problem. It's so much easier to run in favorable districts instead of an uphill climb every time. Another area I would like to see more in Indian Country Today, at least if we can find the money, is to set up the first real national polling on political opinions. Indian Country is difficult to poll because you need such a huge sample size. It's the way it works is the mathematical laws of probability dictate that if there's a sufficient number of people truly chosen at random, then the views are likely to be representative. That's basically the science of polling. So it's often why Indian Country is often an asterisk, because to break out Indian Country as a demographic in a larger pool, you really need a huge sample size. Otherwise, one or two people will answer for all of Indian Country. And of course, that makes no sense. Yet we see it far too often. It's time to come up with a strategy to effectively survey and come up with a scientific-based result. I thank you for your time. I'm really delighted to be here, and feel free to reach out to me if I can answer any questions. As you can see, we're really proud of the operation we're building. And I'm really particularly proud of our election teams and what we're doing with terms of reporting. I hope next election, when people say CNN, there'll be an answer of no. Fox, no. We're only turning on Indian Country Today. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We are running a little late, but please ask the speakers that can stay for 5, 6 more minutes after the hour. Please stay. We want to answer at least 3 more questions or 4 if possible. So I was going to ask Juan Esparza, you had a couple of questions. Can you please go ahead?
Yes, my question is for Frank. In 2012, the Republican Party came out with a plan on reaching out to the Latino community after Mitt Romney lost. And of course, when Trump made a run for the president, that basically got thrown out the window. Do you see the Republicans going back to that with Trump out of the picture? Or do you think Trumpism is so strong that Republicans are gonna not worry about outreach to the Latino community?
Thanks, Juan. Nice to see you. I'm afraid I think it's going to be Trumpism first before there's any reckoning in the Republican Party. People like John McCain and Jeb Bush and others who represent that wing of the Republican Party that's been open to immigration reform, they're gone. They no longer are either on the scene or have the same power. Many of the never Trumpers are people who were supporters of immigration reform from within the Republican Party, and they're no longer part of the party. So I think, unfortunately, the Republican Party will continue to find a, quote, smarter Trump that doesn't tweet. I do think they're going to be challenged, though, because as much as Trump represents everything that I despise about the American experience, he was able to bring out voters like very few other politicians. And I think that while he has an appeal on issues, I think it's more of a cultural, tribal, a white identity appeal that he has. And I do think they're going to have a difficult time recreating what Trump created. So while I think they'll go for a better Trump, I think they're going to find out that Trumpism without Trump isn't much of a force in America. I think about the California Republican Party, which followed Pete Wilson to power and then kept following Wilsonism for many years, and now they're a non-factor in the state. Obviously, the demographics of the country are not the same as the demographics in California, but I think the biggest challenge that we face is that we have a Senate that is disproportionately empowers white rural states. You have 2 senators from Wyoming and 2 senators from North Dakota and 2 senators from California. It doesn't make sense, but that's how our system is designed. The Electoral College, I mean, Joe Biden's and Kamala Harris are going to win by millions of votes in the popular vote, but only because of the distortions of the Electoral College has it been close. So I think we have huge structural problems that are going to require Democrats to amass enough power to change those. Meanwhile, I think Republicans will continue to use racism, xenophobia, and misogyny as the go-to to try to mobilize white grievance voters and win elections where the demographics favor them. I wish I had a more optimistic report, Juan, but I don't think the Republicans will be saved until they have to compete in a 50-50 system.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to combine 2 questions we have here for Mr. Johnson regarding the Black vote. It says, do Black voters share similar support for issues like immigration and Daca? And the other question is, could you also comment on the lower turnout of the Black vote in Florida?
Yeah, so to the first question, usually the 3 issues that are most important to Black voters are the economy and jobs, like it is for most groups, healthcare, and education. And immigration and national security are usually towards the bottom in any list of 8 or 9 issues. I'm not sure exactly why this is. I mean, there are polls within the Black community that who are, I think about 9% of Black Americans are immigrants. And so they are sort of more progressive in their views. And then there is an element within Black America that is more protectionist and believes that immigrants hurt their economy in ways that that sort of exacerbate how Black Americans have been left behind in the national economy anyway. But neither one of those are characteristic of the broader view of immigration within Black America. And unfortunately, it's because there are so many other sort of close-up socioeconomic issues that immigration, because it's not pressing on the community in particular ways, tends to fall out of the top 10 or so there. And then to the question about low voter turnout in Florida, I'm not sure, I haven't seen the numbers, but I would guess 2 things. One, I was just talking about Black immigrants. Florida has a larger Black immigration population than many other states. And so I think that may have something to do with it. Another is Florida has disenfranchised about 1.4 million Black people because of how if you are incarcerated, you lose your right to vote in the state of Florida. And even though they recently voted to re-enfranchise those folks, the government of Florida blocked that. And so I think there is a demoralization that has happened among Black voters in Florida because of all of the stops the government's pulling out to try to complicate access to the polls. And I think we saw that with Andrew Gillum a couple of years ago, and it's played through the Amendment 4 vote just this year. And I'm
Thank
sorry
you for,
to run to another meeting, but thank you so much for having me.
okay, thank you. Thank you. And some of you have been answering questions in the chat. Thank you so much for doing that. And I have questions. I'm going to summarize a couple of questions for Stephen. Stephen Nuno, you still around? I hope you are. I can't see you. So when do you expect the Latino vote in Texas to become sizable enough to turn the state blue is one question. And the other one is, did we see an increase on the Latino vote, and in what percent? And is it true that Latinos move towards Republicans? I think you already answered this, but just in case.
Pilar, I
Yeah.
think we may need to ask if Frank or someone
Oh,
else,
he's gone. Yeah.
Steve
Okay.
had another conference call.
Okay. All right.
And
Okay.
what was the question, Pilar? Sorry.
Okay. So when do you expect the Latino vote in Texas to become sizable enough to turn the state blue?
Yeah. Look, the way this works, and I know there's been a lot of attention to the Latino vote in Texas and there's also in Florida. I know I speak for Pilar on this one, is that we need to complicate the narrative. It's so simplistic and stupid that people think the Latino vote is a certain way. That's like saying the white vote is a certain way. There's progressives, there's conservatives, there's people from different nationalities and backgrounds, different generations, different classes. So we just need to get more sophisticated in our understanding. In Texas, the turnout in the Harris County, the Houston area, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area was huge, overwhelming anything that happened along the border. And it was overwhelmingly Democratic. So that augurs well for the future. But the way you win Texas, like in Florida, is you have to win enough of the white vote too. The majority of Latinos in Florida and the majority of Latinos in Texas voted for Biden-Harris. The majority of white people. So you need, more. What happened is that Biden didn't get as much white vote as he needed in Texas and in Florida. So it's going to be a combination of Latino growth, AAPI growth, and also winning over more white voters. That's the combination. That's how Joe Biden won, the highest number of votes in a presidential race, and the second biggest margin since I believe 1960. But the point is that it's not going to be done just with Latinos. It can't be done without Latinos. And for God's sake, let's not blame Latinos for the fact that these white dominant states voted overwhelmingly for Trump.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, everyone. And I'm going to pass it on to Sandy now.
Yes, just look, this has been an historic election turnout, and clearly the ethnic vote was what delivered the final result. I think that's the major takeaway from all of our speakers. And that's very important for all of us in terms of our reporting. I want to thank the speakers. Thank you, Pilar. And may we have a slightly more relaxing weekend to process this information. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.